Hello and welcome to today's webinar. It's fantastic to see so many of you joining us from across the world today. And I'm delighted to be joined by our course director and our deputy course directors for MA Educational Leadership in Practice, Dr. Paul Armstrong and Dr. B. Hughes, who are going to be discussing the role of collaboration in educational leadership. So we are going to be recording today's webinar. So if your connection drops or you have to leave a little bit early, then in the next few days, we'll be emailing a copy of the recording out for you to watch back and catch up at another time. So I'm just very briefly going to go over what we're going to be covering today. And so we will begin with some introductions before moving on to our main discussion. And we do welcome you to participate today. We do have a lot of attendees, so we recommend that you submit your questions throughout today's session by using the Q&A function, and we'll try and cover as many of them as possible throughout today, either by replying to them directly through the Q&A function or by answering them live. After our discussion from Paul and B, we will then be doing a very brief course overview to introduce the MA Educational Leadership in Practice course in a little bit more detail, and providing our contact details if there is anything else that you do want to ask or think about afterwards that you want to come back to us with further questions about. So for those of you who I've not spoken to before, I'm Hazel and I'm one of the course advisors here at the University of Manchester, and I am based at our centre here in Manchester. I'm here to support prospective students who are considering studying with us, answering as many questions that you have as I can, and ensuring that you have enough information to make an informed decision about going back into study. I'm also joined today in the background by my fellow course advisor, James, who you may see posting something in the chat or answering questions in the Q&A. And I'm now going to hand over to Paul to introduce himself.
Thank you, Hazel. Yeah, good to see so many people here on the webinar today. It's a pleasure to host you all and to be sharing the next 45 minutes with you, discussing educational collaboration, which is an area of particular interest to me as an academic researcher, and something that I've kind of been focused on and preoccupied with in an academic and research sense over the sort of past decade or so. My name's Paul Armstrong. I'm the program director for the MA Educational Leadership in Practice. And yeah, you know, I've been here at the University of Manchester for nearly 20 years now, so I've spent a lot of my career in higher education, academia. Yeah, one of my great sort of passions, I think, is sort of sharing that academic research with practicing education professionals, which is particularly what this MA program is all about. So yeah, it's great to be here with you today, and I look forward to engaging with you all over the next 45 minutes.
And B, over to you to introduce yourself.
Hi, good afternoon, good evening, and indeed good morning. My name is B. Hughes, and I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Manchester, within a colleague of Paul's, within the Manchester Institute of Education, and I'm deputy programme director of this particular course we will be talking about. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was a former head teacher, so I've not been in academia for very long. I worked overseas in Hong Kong for 15 years as a school leader. So it's a wonderful opportunity for us to have, Paul and I, to have a conversation about how collaboration and how partnerships, networking really works and is a real useful practice for us as educational researchers and professionals. So it's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Thank you both for introducing yourselves. So I will hand over to you to start the main discussion.
Great. And I think I'm kicking off, Paul.
I think so.
And it's a great pleasure catching up with you, because I know that you've been working away in the Middle East on behalf of the university. So it's such a great opportunity for us perhaps to catch up a little bit and take a bit of time to talk about particularly your area of expertise, which is, of course, collaboration in education leadership. But perhaps before we get into that, into the meaty weeds of that, maybe you could just start with reminding me, well, I probably know a bit more about you than other people, but me and the audience about your leadership journey, because I know you've had an interesting journey yourself as you're currently programme director. So what was your kind of career trajectory in terms of leadership?
Yeah, thanks, B. I think it's helpful context, and I don't want to. I won't dwell on this for too long because it's quite a long time ago, and I'm I have to sort of rack my brains to sort of remember all the different sort of phases of that. But certainly, I came into educational academia from slightly unorthodox background. Most of my colleagues have come from a sort of education and teaching background. I actually started out as a psychologist originally, very much interested in people and sort of individuals and their behaviour. And I sort of drifted towards sociology, the sort of study of sort of groups of people and communities of people towards the end of that sort of first phase, and also into education as well. Really, my dear mother was a long-serving elementary school teacher for many years, so I guess it's in the family. And so, I've always been sort of interested in sort of research from an educational perspective, but certainly that sort of idea of education as a sort of very much a relational sort of field, that this idea that we learn from each other, and in doing so, in sharing ideas and in working with other people, we sort of develop new ways of doing things and what that sort of looks like in practice and some of the barriers to that and some of the challenges to that. So I suppose it's something that I've always been sort of interested in, how people interact with one another. And I think education is such a great site for studying human interaction because schools, educational organizations are primarily social spaces. That's what they are. They are social organizations. Okay. They have a particular purpose or a range of purposes, I suppose. But, underpinning all of that, the sort of stuff that we measure and the stuff that we test and all the sort of frameworks that we bring, the different sort of contexts bring to bear on those educational organizations and the systems that they exist within, they are social spaces for us. And so this idea of how that sort of social sort of piece helps to sort of drive innovation in education and learning, but also can kind of hold it back as well when we think about some of the sort of contextual conditions. And I guess we'll get into that later in the discussion. So yeah, from a sort of psychologist background and then a sort of very much an academic background, I spent much of my career in schools, in different organizations in education across all different parts of the world, North America, South America, latterly the Middle East and Southeast Asia, a part of the world I'm very fond of, learning about, how education systems have been set up and established and how that sort of interacts with the context of these places and the culture. And then, through that, exploring a little bit about how collaboration works and how it's understood in those different contexts. And of course, the English school system, which we both are a product of and that we both sort of probably spend most of our time exploring. Indeed, we're working on a project at the moment in the English school system. Is very much a sort of hotbed of of kind of government-driven collaboration, and again, we might get into that as well. So it's a great place to do research into educational collaboration, to understand how educational leaders navigate that space. So yeah, very much from a research background, I think. But sort of pivoting towards your experience, B, because of course you've lived and breathed, sort of educational leadership from a much more sort of professional and practical space. You mentioned previously about your experiences of leading in Hong Kong and latterly in England before you stepped away from that to enter a career in academia. Be good to hear your reflections on that, really, and how you came to be, because of course your PhD work, your doctoral work, and was very much sort of situated in notions of networking, wasn't it? So
absolutely, yeah. Well, thanks for that. I think it's interesting you were talking about the relational, and of course the relationship between psychology and sociology, as you quite rightly kind of articulated just then. But what I was interested in, coming from perhaps a reverse engineering process where I was for over 30 years working in high schools all my life, both in the UK and in Hong Kong, and then back to the UK, then became a head teacher in England. And what I sense from what you were saying there, Paul, about leadership generally, is that we can research it, as I've done more latterly in my life, as you've done probably through a lot of your academic life, is that it informs the practice, it informs the relationships, it enables us to think about what we're doing, both as researchers and practical leaders. I mean, you're leading a program, of course. So I think it's helpful to understand that and having that underpinning that you were talking about from sociology and from psychology, particularly sociology of late, which helps us informs ourselves of the practical implications of our work. And obviously our teaching and how we understand how schools and institutions, education institutions are organized and develop and maintain and progress. So I think it's a fascinating topic, and I'm just interested in that interesting relationship between psychology and sociology, particularly because it is all about the relationship. And of course, leadership is all about being in a relationship with many others across one organization, but of course across many others and many constituents of that collaboration. So I think that's quite interesting. I was interested to see what you were saying about that, Paul. Thanks.
Yeah, and I suppose I mean leadership's very much about influence, isn't it? For foremost, I think it's about how we influence other people, or how we are influenced by them. That's very much the essence of leadership, isn't it? And of course, that takes us into discussions around power and privilege, which are things that we very much explore through the MA Education Leadership in Practice, because that's something that we're concerned with as academics from University of Manchester, which is a very sort of critical space in that sense. Quite a left-leaning part of the world, and we're kind of concerned with ideas of power and privilege, and who holds that power and who holds that privilege, and who doesn't have access to it. And a lot of that is kind of tied up with this idea of sort of influence, isn't it? How, and that's, as I said, the essence of what sort of leadership is. I mean, but before we get into some of those sort of more higher brow sort of academic and sociological discussions, actually, it'd be helpful actually for maybe say some of your reflections about what collaboration in education actually looks like in practice across sort of classrooms and schools and localities and different systems. We've talked already about the sort of international lens that we apply to our thinking, and a lot of that comes from the amazing sort of diversity of students that we have on this program. Actually, I think we've had over 50 different countries represented on this program in the 5 years that we've been running it. And what that has allowed and afforded us, I think, is this sort of richness of kind of experience that we've been able to learn about and learn from all of our students, educational leaders in different sectors from all over the world. But I mean, from your perspective, from your research and from your own professional role and experience and history, what does it look like in sort of practice?
That's a great question, actually. How long have you got? I think the point about the international leaning, particularly this program, is a real excellent catalyst for us to think about collaboration. And whilst, as we will talk about, I'm sure, the context in where we operate, in which we operate, international contexts, local contexts, context with multi-academy trusts, groups of schools in England and so on and so forth, or private education institutions or universities across the world and so on. The fundamental aspect, I think, for practically for effective collaboration has to be around the notion of trust. Whether it is a school trusting somebody to take on something, let's call it a working party for the sake of argument. And for that school, which my head did for me when I was a deputy head in England, and she gave me a lot of opportunity to develop a collaborative piece of work that we were studying about a curriculum policy and so on. So I think it's bound up by trust. It's bound up by having a joint commitment, I think, to whatever the project is or whatever the vision is or whatever the purpose is of the collaborative process, however big or small. So it could be a small little departmental working party looking at marking and assessment. It could be a whole big project where we're combining 2 or 3 organizations and merging them, as it happened with the University of Manchester in 2004. Of course, 2 universities came together. Can you imagine the collaborative planning that had to be? But importantly, how we trusted, or how the idea of trust was meshed with our practical work. So I think trust, I think understanding the purpose of what we're doing, and we'll get on to our research in Merseyside a little bit more, sorry, perhaps about trust and leadership there. But certainly I think it's trust. I think it's about having a clear purpose. I think it's about getting people who are committed, who have a shared understanding. So people who are on the right bus, if you like, who understand what the purpose is and are committed to that. And I think obviously, you know, when you're investing people's time and energies and resources in a professional context, there has to be some form of evaluation, and it's cyclical often, and some form of accountability. So, you know, shifting from cooperation to collaboration is an interesting idea as well. You know, we can cooperate in the staff room, but actually formal collaboration needs to be rooted in those aspects, I would suggest.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I
Yeah.
think there's also something um, around sort of context, isn't there, as well? Our esteemed colleague, Professor Mel Ainscough, who's written and discussed and talks about collaboration education for a good portion of his career, you know, a sort of expert, world-leading expert in this area, reminds us that context matters, and it matters a great deal. You referred then to the two big Manchester universities that sort of merged a couple of decades ago, and I expect that was made as difficult as it was, as challenging as it wasn't as complex as it was. I imagine that was made more straightforward by the fact that both of those universities were serving the same city in the same part of the world. And I think, you know, in a context like England, where we have a lot of government-led, what we might refer to as top-down sort of collaborative structures that have been put in place, you tend to find that those kind of collaborative activities and that kind of collaborative partnerships that tend to become more deeply embedded, and therefore I would argue more purposeful, tend to be when they're between schools or organisations from the same kind of region, the same locality, because they're serving the same context, so they've got the same issues and they've got the same priorities, and they understand that sort of local need, you know, in a way that allows them to work together on the same sort of issues. And I think, you know, having that sort of common agenda, whether it's a common problem or a common priority or a common purpose, we might call it a sort of vision or something like that, maybe. But you know, not to get too sort of corporate in that sort of language. I think those things are really, really important, you know.
Yeah.
And certainly the research tells us that. There's probably something there for about geography as well. Of course, we can all collaborate or cooperate to a degree from wherever we are in the world, and we're doing it now. I mean, but you know, the depth and the purpose to which we can, and the extent to which we can do that, is probably to a degree affected by sort of, you know, geography in that sense. And that's not, there's a practical issue there, I suppose. Unless you want all of your collaborations to be online, it's difficult to imagine anything massively meaningful happening across, you know, significant geographical distances, particularly when you're talking about schools, you know, and you want pupils perhaps to visit other schools, or teachers or leaders to spend time in other schools learning from their peers. That geographical thing is important as well. But I think beyond the practical, I think the context piece is really sort of important, you know. So
Yeah, can I pick you up on that? Because that's a really interesting point about the kind of school to school or organization to organization, the kind of para school or para organization. And I think, certainly in my experience, the greater success, for want of a better word, of collaborative work has been within the school, because people are more perhaps emotionally invested in their own students, their own staff, and so on and so forth. And I think it's relatively straightforward. There are tensions with any kind of collaborative marriage, of course, but I think in a school on a micro level, it's potentially a little bit easier. I think where it gets more difficult and more challenging, and therefore I think there needs to be people who are quite skilled in bringing these major players, if you like, together, and trying to understand, you know, what the needs are of various organizations. They become more partnerships, and I think, you know, that is a really interesting shift between collaboration, cooperation, and then suddenly we're working into partnerships and then networks, which are equally powerful, slightly different in their composition, but certainly equally powerful in terms of shifting and moving and generating, you know, a common goal for us, you know, within education. It's that values related, isn't it, towards leading our schools and supporting our schools and researching in our schools or in our educational institutions, in terms of higher education. So I think the tensions are probably more complicated in relation to, and have to be really thought about in relation to kind of more organizational collaboration rather than within the school, within the context, which is familiar and valued, and you know, and is less probably full of tensions, and may I even suggest micropolitics, but perhaps we don't want to get onto that today.
That's probably a whole different discussion. Although politics, of course, is very important in
Yeah,
that sense, small p and big P as well. I mean, we've kind of drifted towards some of the barriers
yeah,
to collaborative sort of practice, and I think it's probably worth picking up on some of those, because, of course, collaboration is often made out to be something that's very straightforward, and it's therefore a sort of, you know, a solution to a lot of the kind of social issues that schools and educational organizations are sort of faced with, that create so many kind of challenges for school leaders and teachers in their classrooms. Not least the sort of, you know, significant notion of sort of ensuring that our schools are sort of places of sort of equity and inclusion, for example. And I know, again, that's something that we are very much preoccupied here with at Manchester, creating equitable and inclusive school systems and places where, you know, education is sort of accessible for all students. And of course, collaboration is very important in that in that sense. We know from the research that those education systems across the globe that are more equitable,
yeah,
and are more accessible to more students from across the social sort of spectrum,
yeah,
tend to be those where, you know, collaboration is much more a sort of active ingredient, I think, in their structures. And I think part of that for me is this idea of sort of moving knowledge around, you know, and this is something that we've written about in the past, and I think something that we will continue to do so. I think, because I think it's really important. You know, in England, for example, and this may resonate with others on the webinar from their own context. We have a school system that's very much an education system that's very much set up as a sort of competitive space. It's a competitive arena. Okay, so schools and education organizations sort of compete for pupils, because, of course, with each pupil, with each student, they receive a certain amount of money. Okay, and so what that does is it creates a sort of system in which schools tend to be a bit introspective with their knowledge and their ideas, because they don't want to share them, because they want to stay ahead of the pack, whether that's at the top of the league table or with a favourable inspection report, so that they can continue to attract, you know, enough pupils to be sustainable and to maintain that sort of financial income. So the system in England, I think, very much is very much sort of set up to facilitate and encourage competition, much less so collaboration. But of course, when we're thinking about sort of notions of equity, and perhaps those schools in those areas of the country that are less are more socially and economically sort of disadvantaged, I would say, right. Opening up access for teachers and leaders and pupils in those areas to all of that amazing knowledge that exists within a school system is really important, isn't it? You know, and in a competitive system, what happens is that, you know, these tend to find that those schools that have the more powerful networks in the more affluent areas tend to get stronger and more successful. You know, and we could talk about that, because it's a contested term, and those that aren't tend to struggle and fall a bit by the wayside. So again, you know, to sort of paraphrase Professor Malensko, who's talked about this a lot, you know, I think this idea that we need to open up the sort of pathways so that we can move more knowledge around the system more freely. And I think in doing that, you know, we open up sort of access to education in a much more meaningful way to young people and communities from across the social spectrum. And collaboration is a big sort of part of that. I think it's about sharing knowledge, isn't it?
It is, and that's such an interesting point you referred to as opening the pathways, because that, in the sense, is of course the absolute, you know, bones of collaboration. You know, that it's open, and I think certainly in our experience with our research project we're both involved with, where we are talking to so many different people from so many different organizations, both charitable, third sector, and professional organizations such as schools and colleges and so on, and having the privilege of speaking to them. This is a 3-year research project Paul and I are involved with in England, And it's interesting when we talk to individuals from, for example, who are connecting families together from a challenging area, situated in a challenging area, the level of collaboration and buy-in is quite extraordinary, in that they see the purpose, the need, and the positive outcomes that they and others are having within that whole small area, which is really challenged economically. And I'm just thinking, Paul, you and I were over there a few months ago, and we were talking to people in the MDT team, the multidisciplinary team, which is a brilliant model of collaboration. I don't know what your feelings were about, that particular example of wider collaboration. The key is obviously to support children in schools and beyond their career, from their cradle to the career. That's the project. But I'm just wondering how you felt about that collaborative work that was going on before our very eyes, actually, when we were over.
Yeah, it's a really good example, I think, because I think it demonstrates that what happens in school, it can't be detached from what happens in society, and it shouldn't be. Schools do not exist in a sort of vacuum. They are a microcosm, or they're a mirror, if you like, of what's happening in a wider society. So, I mean, I've been very privileged in my career to have spent time in schools all over the world. And I always say to people, if you want to get an understanding of a place, whether that's a particular country or a particular region of a country or a particular town or village or township or locality, if you can, the best thing to do is go and spend a bit of time in the school, because you'll learn so much about that place by being in a school, because the school reflects the society that it serves, very much so. So, but what that also means is that you can't treat schools as if they exist in a vacuum. What happens in school is hugely affected by what's happening outside of school. And again, just to sort of reiterate the point, if we have to create more sort of equitable school systems, and more effective school systems, more purposeful school systems, it requires a sort of a collaborative effort between all of those other pillars of society that support a young person's development. So it's not just education. Education is very important, but it's health, it's social care, it's housing, it's career development and training, and opportunities for employment. And it's social spaces as well. So all of those things that make an area what it is, need to be sort of connected. And of course, that's challenging, because all of those different factions have agendas, don't they?
Yeah.
And this brings us to a particular nub of an issue with collaboration, really, that you can have a group of actors in a social space all pulling in the same direction, but they've all got their own agenda. And of course, where those agendas cross, it's a bit like a Venn diagram, I suppose. There's a tiny slither where they all cross together, and that's where the sort of magical sort of collaboration can happen. But most of the rest of the time, they're working on their own agendas in their own space, their own silos, if you like, because that's what they're paid to do, or that's what their responsibilities are. And so that's where collaboration is tricky, and that's why it's not necessarily always the answer to all of the issues that schools face, that educators face, that society faces. Finding ways of sharing knowledge and ideas is important, but doing it in a way that doesn't, sort of cut across people's core responsibilities and put people off and make them turn away and go back to their silos is just as important as well. And that's the really tricky bit, I think, of collaboration, particularly when you're talking about collaboration between different social actors, so not just schools, but local authorities or district authorities and healthcare and local businesses. That sort of stuff's messy, and you kind of have to embrace that messiness and understand that it's tricky work. But when it works, it can be really, really powerful and purposeful.
I think that example of the multidisciplinary team that you hinted at, which consists of groups of people situated in the locale, in the context, in where the challenges are for these young people in schools, our research project. And what is interesting about that particular group of people is they come from all professional backgrounds and voluntary backgrounds, and they just sit in a big room. And actually, often that's the way to actually understand each other's challenges, tensions, context, politics, and work together in order to support young people in their journey through their educational processes, which, as we know, can be very challenging and problematic and often traumatic for some of them. And so you mentioned health and housing. And you mentioned obviously education, and I think, and then the voluntary sector around that, the youth groups, the voluntary organisations that can respond to a need in a particular moment. But to get all those people together, understanding what the purpose is, takes a bit of effort, as you say, and despite your local politics and the funding arrangements and the challenges of resourcing, it takes a lot of effort. Emotional investment, actually, I would say, and leadership. I think there's that point of influence. If we see leadership as a form of influence, it takes a lot of constituents to get to the progress to move on and be successful over time. And of course, we talk a lot about the sustainability. Do we sustain our collaborations, partnerships? Are they able to be sustained? And this is a conversation we're having at the moment with this particular research we're undertaking, the sustainability of such collaborations, because it takes effort and time and commitment and emotional involvement, really. So it's an interesting point. And I think, the role of leaders in this is really key.
Yeah, and if we just pivot back to leaders specifically, then
Yeah.
in leadership, I've got half an hour on the time, and I
Yeah.
know we need to hand the floor back to Hazel for a few minutes towards the end of this session. So, one of the things I think that schools across the world, and certainly, from my experience of visiting schools all over the world, and from more importantly, spending time with teachers from different parts of the world who share their experiences, professional experiences from their particular spaces and contexts, is that schools, like many organizations, remain quite hierarchical places, don't they, in terms of leadership structure. Most schools still have a single individual who is the principal of that school, or the head teacher, or whatever label that they are ascribed. And then it's their name above the door, if you like. It's that they hold ultimate responsibility for what happens in that school. So they're therefore accountable for what happens in the school in terms of pupil progress, results, safeguarding, all those important things that make up a young person's journey through that particular school and their education. So how from your experience, do we pivot, or at least maybe not so much pivot, because the hierarchy exists in one sense, but how do we also encompass sort of flatter structures, beyond just giving everyone a leadership label and telling everybody that they are a leader? Because of course, we can do that fairly easily, but what does that mean in practice? So how do we make schools more collaborative spaces, both within, between, and beyond the school?
That's a great question. And I think one of it, I'm just, thinking very much about the accountability structure that operates in the English system, where we are performativity and accountability is the two buzzwords. And I think if you're a courageous, leader, for want of a better word, head teacher, CEO, whatever it is, principal, then you choose to resist as far as you can some of those oppressive regimes of accountability. You can't, reject them all. And then you create with others a culture that celebrates and takes risks and is bound up by partnerships, collaborations, relationships. And I think that really helps a school progress and be probably I won't say happy place, but a happier place than those schools that are just constantly defending themselves because of whatever it is. And therefore it becomes a safer and more enjoyable place to be as a child. And I think the other thing for leaders, certainly I was very fortunate to run a school where I felt very strongly that to understand how the school operates by walking around it along the corridors, engaging with students at break time. I had my door open to my lovely office, by the way, was always open unless I was in a meeting. So I felt people could, and they did, students, not parents, they had to make an appointment, but teachers and my colleagues on the staff, but particularly children, students, high school students, would just pop in and talk. And by that, I was collaborating with their experiences. I started to understand what it was actually like, not to the nth degree, but to a certain degree, understand what it was like to be part of a school, whether it be from a student's perspective or a member of staff, whomever they were. And I think that helps. That openness helps. And the other thing, I think helps is this you're safe to ask the question. You know, there's no such things as stupid question. We talk about that with our master students, right? You know, every question is really key. Every question is really important. And because we seek to engender that sort of work and that sort of response where we are open to being questioned, but we also can ask the question ourselves as leaders or as facilitators. And I think that does establish, not always, but it does establish an openness, which actually is very, it lends itself to, you know, effective collaborative work. And I think the final point I think we should make, and we do acknowledge, and I think, you know, in my experience of being in higher education for the last 8 or 9 years, I think I've sensed a great collaboration with academics. Academics are very good at collaborating with their work. They do lots of joint writing, you know, academic journals. They do a lot of joint editing. We do a lot of joint teaching, and so on and so forth. We're doing a lot of conversations now, which are in of themselves collaborative. So I think we need to value that, and we need to articulate that we value that, you know, and that we value these interactions, however short they are, because that is all part of, you know, the kind of coming together, you know, partnering and knowledge and understanding, and getting a deeper, more significant understanding of how we are and how we're being as professionals and as teachers and as academics. And I think that's really key. In fact, what springs to mind, Paul, in our building in Manchester, there's a ground floor that was a series of geography labs that our teacher trainers used. And they've just decided to modernise it. And I've been part of the vision for this space. And part of the vision was to try and open up the, you know, knock down the walls, open up the space where people can sit, have a decent cup of coffee and talk. And once you get that open, you know, social discourse happening, despite the challenges we've had post-COVID and working from home and all the rest of it, one hopes that that will generate a happy, useful, you know, creative space to collaborate, to work, to sit, to talk. And I think if schools can be like that, many of the libraries and schools I've worked in are very good places for that. Although sometimes you have to be very quiet, depending on your librarian. You know, that you can talk and debate and ask a stupid question, and be respected for that. And I think that's really part of collaboration in terms of a practical way, in terms of the role of a teacher or a leader, and a student as well, of course. So I think that's key.
Thanks, B. I think that's a really sort of seems like an appropriate way to sort of draw to the end of our discussion here, because I think we need to give Hazel a few moments just to wrap up. So I've got a few slides to share. Hazel, are we okay to hand the floor back to you now?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. And thank you both for sharing your thoughts and your experience as well on this topic. And I hope that everyone listening has enjoyed hearing it. So as Paul said, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sort of just share a few slides with you and introduce our MA Educational Leadership in Practice course, which Paul is course director for and B is the deputy course director for. So this course is a part-time online and blended learning course, and it's taught both here in Manchester and also from our international centres, which are based in Dubai, Hong Kong, Shanghai and Singapore. And I know that we've got people watching today who are probably located closer to each of those centres. So one thing to just point out with this is that from each of our international centres, you do receive exactly the same high quality Manchester education as you do one centre to another. And you're learning from the academics based in the Manchester Institute of Education, both B and Paul and a number of other colleagues. Now, what makes this course a blended course is that you are encouraged to attend 2 3-day conferences or workshops per year at our international centres. And that's why we tell you to apply to the course that's closest to you geographically, because it does make it much easier for you to attend. If you did want to attend a workshop at one of the other centres in your second year, there is the option to do that as well. So with this course, each unit is taught online, one at a time through our virtual learning environment, and the learning materials and the deadlines are released at the start of each unit. And we anticipate that you're going to spend about 15 to 20 hours a week on study, but the exact time that you need is going to very much depend on your own personal learning style. So we can't give that with exactness, but we can say it's usually for most people between about 15 and 20 hours a week of study. And the course does take 24 months to complete in total, so it's those 2 years of study. And something that I know a lot of our students are always really happy about is that we don't have any exams. All your assessments are coursework based. So on screen you can see a list of our course units, and as I mentioned, these run one at a time, and they run in a 10-week block, with the assessments taking place towards the end of each unit before you start the next. So it's designed this way to ensure that you have the time to reflect upon your studies, complete the assessments, to be able to watch your video lectures, to be able to interact in your tutorials without spreading yourself too thinly, because we do recognise that the majority of people studying this course are juggling a full-time job as well. And so you'll complete those taught units first, those 6 taught units, before you then move on to an independent supervised study or project. And that's made up of 2 different components, which is research skills and the application of research to professional practice, and a project-based inquiry. And if you do want to find out more about that as well, I'm going to share some links into the chat, and you can find out more information on the course page, and there'll also be a link at the end of the slides as well. So the entry requirements for the course, if basically you need a good honours degree, a minimum of 2-1 or the overseas equivalent, and if you have an initial teaching qualification, at least 1 year's teaching experience, then that's also desirable. And if you did you fall slightly short of that 2-1 in your previous studies, applicants with a 2-2 can be considered if they have at least 3 years of teaching experience as well. And in terms of the English language, if English is your second language, we will also require evidence that you have English language to the equivalent of an IELTS of 6.5 overall, with no less than 6.5 in writing and no other subsection below 6 or the equivalent. And there are a number of different English qualifications that we accept, and it's not something that you would need before you apply to the course. It's something that our admissions team can help you to get that English test if you do need it. So you apply online for the course, and I've just shared the link in the chat, so there is a link there for if you want to go on to apply for the course, and all of that is done online. Now, in terms of the fees for the course, you can see that this year the fees are £17,000, and there are a number of different discounts, scholarships and funding options available. So your best bet is to contact your international centre for more information, because it does vary centre to centre. But for September 2025 in Manchester, it includes our discount structure includes discount for state schools on our UK state school bursary. We also have an alumni discount and an application discount of 10% if you were to apply by the 30th of June 2025. Now, the exact amount of discount you're entitled to will vary depending on your circumstances. So if you do have questions about that, I would encourage you to email us studyonline@manchester.ac.uk, and we can run through that with you. And like I say, if you're not based closest to Manchester, then do contact your nearest international centre, and they will be able to give you more information. If you're not sure who that is, then you can also contact us, and we can help put you in touch with the right person. So that very much brings me to the end of the formal presentation, and I can see that we do have one question that's already been asked. Thank you, Dina. So you've asked about whether you're required to have an IELTS test. So the answer to that is you're required to show evidence of English language ability. So we do accept a variety of different qualifications. If you don't have the IELTS, but you have something like, you might have something else then you may want to use, then you could submit that as evidence instead. So if you don't have an English language qualification as well, you can still apply to the course, and our admissions team they will be able to help you to arrange an English test after you've submitted an application to the programme. So I hope that covers it. Without knowing specifically if you're thinking of a particular qualification, it's hard to go into too much detail. But if you do have more questions about that, if you email studyonline@manchester.ac.uk, then I'll be able to perhaps give you a little bit more information about that. Okay, and I can't see any other questions coming through at the moment. So I think the main thing for me really to say is to just say that this concludes today's webinar. I want to also say thank you to Bea and Paul for taking the time today. And Dina, I think I can see that you've just come back asking for a little bit of clarification here with the English test. I think you're probably going to need to email us and give us some more detail, because it depends on your own personal context. So I think you need probably some more personalised advice with your question about the English tests. So if you send me an email at studyonline@manchester.ac.uk, and then I'll be able to give you a bit more information about that. And I can see someone's also just submitted something there for Paul as well in the questions. I don't know if you wanted to comment on any of that, Paul, just giving you a chance to read it.
Yeah, I'm just aware of the time. It's a great question. Yeah, I think it's a great question. Sorry, I don't want to pronounce your name wrong. Is it so? Please, apologies for any mispronunciation. But your work in sort of in Armenia, I think, is fascinating. I'd love to hear more about that. I've had a contact with some colleagues in Kazakhstan, a sort of post-socialist context, which is probably has some similarities with Armenia. And I think, I'm always fascinated, as I said, by this idea of context and how it shapes education systems, and then therefore shapes what happens in those education systems in schools and stuff. And of course, that very much shapes sort of collaboration as well. I think the review that we undertook in 2021 was very much based in the UK, the English system. And I do think the field has moved on a little bit since then. There's been an awful lot of work on sort of social network analysis from sort of North American colleagues and South American colleagues actually as well, looking at this sort of what actually happens between those sort of individual actors within particular education systems, and what does that collaboration look like, and what's the sort of strength of those sort of ties. And I know that's something that Bea has been interested in as well with her own research in terms of networks. So I think there's an awful lot more work to do in this area, theoretically, particularly. I think there's, the collaborative space within the field is quite theory light still. And as I said, there's still an assumption that any kind of activity where two or more people work together constitutes collaboration, and therefore that's inherently a good thing. And of course, we know that it's a lot more complicated than that, and it warrants much further research. But I think importantly, I think it warrants, as with the leadership space, it warrants research from different contexts. And so I think your work would have a significant contribution to make to our understanding of collaboration. So thank you so much for sort of sharing that. And if you do want to reach out, please drop me an email. I'll be happy to talk further. Thank you.
Okay, so I think that does bring us to the end of our questions today. So I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you very much to Bea and to Paul, and to everyone who has joined us and watched our webinar today. If we've not come to your question and you do have anything else you want to ask, please do send us an email, studyonline@manchester.ac.uk. And thank you very much as well to our audience for taking the time out of your days to join us.